Dr. Sarah Mitchell's latex gloves froze mid-incision, her scalpel suspended above the gaping wound as her eyes widened behind surgical glasses. The operating room fell into absolute silence, except for the steady beep of monitors. It wasn't the sebaceous cyst they'd expected to find inside Martha Thompson's 6-year growth. A surgical nurse stumbled backward, her instrument tray clattering to the sterile floor as metallic objects scattered across white tiles. The anesthesiologist's hands trembled as he checked Martha's vitals twice, unable to process what lay exposed before them. Another nurse pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp. 74-year-old Martha had carried this secret for decades, teaching 3 generations of Millbrook's children to read, never knowing their gentle teacher harbored something impossible beneath her carefully arranged silver hair. The woman who'd led annual Christmas pageants had been hiding evidence of a life they couldn't imagine. "Dear God," Dr. Mitchell whispered, backing away from the table. "Call security immediately." What had Martha Thompson been concealing all these years, and why was it surfacing now? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Martha Ellen Thompson had perfected the art of invisibility in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. At 74, the former Millbrook Elementary beloved teacher had transformed from the woman who once led the annual Christmas pageant into someone who slipped through shadows, timing her grocery runs for the empty hours just after dawn. The Victorian house on Elm Street, where she'd lived for 35 years with her late husband Robert, had become her fortress. Paint peeled from the shutters like old skin, and the rose garden Robert had tended with such pride now grew wild and untamed. Martha preferred it that way. Less attention, fewer questions about why the woman who'd once been crowned Miss Millbrook County in 1970 now wore elaborate scarves even in the sweltering Ohio summers. The lump had started innocently enough, a small bump behind her left ear that she'd dismissed as another indignity of aging. "Getting old ain't for sissies," she'd mutter to Robert's photograph each morning, the same phrase her grandmother had used when Martha was young and thought 70 seemed impossibly ancient. But as months turned to years, the growth had developed a mind of its own, expanding like a secret that refused to stay buried. Martha's days followed a rigid pattern designed to avoid human contact. Morning coffee with Robert's picture, where she'd update him on the weather and the stray cats that had claimed her back porch. Afternoon soap operas that reminded her of simpler times when other people's drama seemed manageable. Evening phone calls that never came from a son who'd built a life 2,000 miles away and seemed content to keep it that way. James Thompson, her only child, was 45 and thriving as an architect in Seattle. Their relationship had cooled to obligatory holiday cards and birthday phone calls that grew shorter each year. He'd stopped visiting after Robert's funeral 3 years ago, claiming work demanded his attention. Martha suspected the truth was more complicated, that her grief made him uncomfortable, that her small-town life felt suffocating to someone who designed skyscrapers and attended gallery openings. The financial reality of her situation gnawed at Martha like a persistent ache. Her teacher's pension covered the basics, but Medicare's gaps felt like canyons when facing potential medical bills. The house, nearly paid off after decades of careful budgeting, represented her only real security. She'd rather suffer in silence than risk losing the home where she'd graded thousands of spelling tests and nursed Robert through his final illness. Neighbor Betty Mae Wilson, the only person who still attempted regular contact, had grown increasingly suspicious of Martha's hermit-like behavior. "Martha Ellen, when's the last time you came to church?" she'd call through the screen door. "Pastor Williams asks about you every Sunday." But Martha had perfected the art of being perpetually under the weather or just heading out whenever Betty Mae appeared with casseroles and concerned expressions. What Betty Mae couldn't see, what nobody could see, was how Martha's simple morning routine of brushing her silver hair had become an exercise in careful positioning and strategic angles. The mandatory Medicare enrollment meeting at Millbrook Community Center arrived like a summons Martha couldn't ignore. For weeks she'd thrown away the notices, but the final letter carried the weight of federal requirement. Attend or lose benefits. At 74, with a teacher's pension that barely covered utilities, Martha couldn't afford to play games with her health care coverage. She spent an hour in front of her bedroom mirror, arranging and rearranging the silk scarf that had become her armor. The lump, now roughly the size of a tennis ball, had developed its own geography, peaks and valleys that defied concealment. No matter how she positioned the fabric, something seemed wrong, asymmetrical, obvious to anyone who looked closely. The community center buzzed with the familiar faces of Millbrook's elderly population, people who remembered Martha as the dedicated teacher who'd shaped their grandchildren's early years. She chose a seat in the back corner, pulling her wide-brimmed hat lower over her eyes, praying to get through the presentation without incident. Halfway through the Medicare representative's explanation of Part D coverage, Martha felt the warm wetness against her neck. The lump had begun to weep, a thin, clear fluid that had started appearing over the past month. She pressed her hand to the scarf, feeling the moisture seep through the silk. Mrs. Thompson, the voice belonged to Janet Mills, whose daughter had been in Martha's 1995 third-grade class. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." Martha forced a smile, keeping her hand pressed against her neck. "Just a little warm in here, dear. All these people, you know." But as she spoke, she felt more fluid, and the metallic scent that had been haunting her for weeks seemed stronger. The scarf, once powder blue, was darkening with moisture. Martha excused herself and hurried toward the restroom, but the damage was spreading faster than she could walk. By the time she reached the hallway, the silk had turned crimson. "Oh, my Lord," gasped Betty Mae Wilson, the church organist. "Martha, you're bleeding!" The hallway erupted in concerned voices. "Someone call 911! Get her a chair! What is that thing?" The last comment, whispered but audible, sent ice through Martha's veins. She pulled the scarf tighter, but it was useless now. The secret she'd hidden for 6 years was bleeding through her fingers. Martha ran, through the community center doors, across the parking lot, and down Elm Street toward home, leaving behind a room full of shocked neighbors and a blood-stained tile floor. Behind her, she could hear Betty Mae's voice calling her name. But Martha didn't stop until she reached her front door, fumbled with the lock, and collapsed inside her hallway. For 3 days, Martha refused to answer her door or her phone. And she survived on crackers and water, too ashamed to face the world, too frightened to seek help. The bleeding had stopped, but the humiliation felt permanent. Everyone would know now. Everyone would talk. On the 4th day, Betty Mae Wilson made the call Martha had been dreading. "James, it's Betty Mae, your mother's neighbor. Son, you need to come home. Something's wrong with Martha, and I don't think she's got much time to argue about it." James Thompson was in the middle of a client presentation for a $50 million commercial project when his phone rang. He almost ignored it. Colorado area code meant it wasn't work, but something made him excuse himself and take the call. 26 hours later, he stood on his childhood front porch, using the key Martha had hidden under the same flower pot for 30 years. The house smelled stale, closed up like grief that had settled into the furniture. He found his mother in Robert's old recliner, wearing a bathrobe at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the television playing to an empty room. "Mom!" The woman who turned toward him was barely recognizable. Martha had always been proud of her appearance. Lipstick at breakfast, hair styled for grocery shopping, the kind of woman who believed in maintaining standards. This person was hollow-eyed, rail-thin, and wearing a scarf indoors in October. "You didn't need to come," Martha said, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd fought a battle too long alone. "Betty Mae had no right to call you." James pulled up Robert's old ottoman and sat facing his mother for the first time in 2 years. The distance between them felt measured in more than miles, in phone calls that grew shorter, visits that grew rarer. In the gradual way, grief had carved canyons between people who once shared everything. "Mom, when's the last time you ate a real meal?" "This house?" He gestured around the living room where dust-covered family photographs and newspapers dated from weeks ago sat unread. "This isn't living. This is dying in slow motion." Martha's hand went instinctively to her neck, adjusting the scarf. "I've managed fine for 74 years without your help, James. I don't need charity from my own son." "Look at yourself," James said, his voice cracking with 2 years of suppressed worry. "When's the last time you looked in a mirror?" The silence stretched between them until Martha finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I haven't looked at myself, really looked, in 6 years." The confrontation between mother and son reached its breaking point when James gently reached toward Martha's scarf. She recoiled as if he'd struck her, pressing herself deeper into Robert's recliner. "Don't," she whispered, her voice carrying decades of shame. "Please, don't." But James had seen enough. The way she protected her neck, the blood-stained scarf she'd worn for days, the fear in her eyes when anyone came too close. "Mom, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. How long has this been going on?" Martha's composure finally cracked. Tears she'd held back for months spilled down her cheeks as she pulled the scarf away, revealing the mass that had consumed the left side of her neck. James didn't flinch, though she saw his jaw tighten and his hands clench into fists. 6 years, she whispered. "Maybe a little more. It started small, just a little bump. I thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence about getting old, about accepting decline, about being too proud and too poor to face reality. James was already reaching for his phone. "We're going to the doctor today. Right now." "James, honey, you don't understand. The money. I don't care about the money." His voice was sharp with frustration and fear. "Mom, this thing is bigger than a softball. How have you been living with this?" The drive to Dr. Patricia Reynolds' office passed in silence. Martha sat rigidly in the passenger seat of James's rental car, watching familiar neighborhoods blur past. Every turn brought them closer to a reckoning she'd avoided for years. When they pulled into the medical center parking lot, she made one last attempt at retreat. "I can't afford this, James. Medicare doesn't cover everything, and I won't burden you with—" "Stop." James turned off the engine and faced his mother. "Just stop. We'll figure out the money. We'll figure out everything, but we're not driving home until someone explains what's happening to you." Dr. Reynolds had been the Thompson family physician for 15 years, the woman who'd guided Robert through his final illness and signed the death certificate that ended 43 years of marriage. When Martha removed her scarf in the examination room, even her professional composure wavered. "Martha," she said softly, pulling on latex gloves, "this should have been addressed years ago. Why didn't you come to me?" "The examination was thorough and uncomfortable, Doctor." Reynolds's gentle probing revealed that the mass was firm, irregular, and had developed its own network of blood vessels. When she pressed certain areas, Martha winced, admitting to pain she'd been managing with over-the-counter medications and sheer stubbornness. "The size and complexity of this growth puts you at serious risk," Dr. Reynolds explained, her words measured and careful. "Infection, hemorrhage, possible malignancy. Martha, this needs immediate surgical intervention." "What kind of surgery?" James asked when his mother remained silent. "This is beyond my expertise. I'm referring you to Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Regional Medical Center. She's the chief of surgery, specializes in complex cases." Dr. Reynolds was already writing the referral, her pen scratching across prescription paper with urgent efficiency. "I'm calling ahead to expedite the appointment." The financial reality hit Martha like cold water. "Doctor, I need to know what this will cost." "I live on a fixed income, and I can't—" Dr. Reynolds interrupted her gently. "Martha, we're past the point of financial considerations. Without treatment, this condition could be life-threatening. Let's focus on getting you healthy, and we'll work out the details afterward." But Martha knew better. She'd seen too many elderly neighbors face the choice between medication and groceries, between necessary procedures and keeping their homes. Medicare. Part B covered 80% of approved procedures, but 20% of a major surgery could easily reach thousands of dollars, money she simply didn't have. That evening, while Martha rested in her bedroom, James explored the house he'd grown up in but hadn't really seen in years. What he discovered broke his heart. In the kitchen he found a pill organizer with compartments labeled for 7 days, but only every other day was filled. Martha had been rationing her heart medication. In the study, he found a shoebox filled with medical bills she'd been ignoring, collection notices for a mammogram from 2 years ago, and letters from specialists she'd never seen. The financial pressure had been building for years, and his mother had chosen suffering in silence over asking for help. The most devastating discovery came when he was looking for Martha's insurance cards. Hidden in her jewelry box, underneath Robert's watch and her mother's pearl necklace, James found a manila envelope containing $18,000 in cash, Martha's emergency fund, saved penny by penny from her teacher's pension. She had the money for surgery, but had been hoarding it like a lifeline, terrified that spending it would leave her destitute. When he confronted her about the hidden money, Martha's response revealed the depth of her fear. "That money is all that stands between me and the county nursing home," she said quietly. "If I spend it on surgery and something else happens, if I can't take care of myself anymore, what then? Medicare doesn't pay for long-term care, James. That money might be the difference between dying in my own bed and dying among strangers." The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night. James learned about the daily calculations his mother made, choosing between air conditioning and groceries during hot summers, delaying dental work, driving a car with bald tires because new ones cost $400 she couldn't spare. "Why didn't you tell me?" James asked, his voice thick with guilt. "All these years, why didn't you ask for help?" Martha's answer cut to the heart of their relationship. "Because you built a life without me in it, son. You call on Christmas and my birthday. You haven't visited since your father's funeral. What was I supposed to think? That you wanted to hear about my problems?" The truth hung between them. James had been so focused on escaping Millbrook's limitations that he'd abandoned the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities she'd never had. The regional medical center loomed over Millbrook like a modern cathedral, all glass and steel that made Martha feel small and out of place. She'd dressed in her best Sunday outfit, a navy dress Robert had always complimented, pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and the dreaded scarf arranged with military precision. James walked beside her through the automatic doors, carrying a folder thick with insurance papers and the weight of 2 years' worth of guilt. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office occupied a corner of the surgical wing, its walls lined with diplomas and awards that spoke to decades of medical excellence. When the doctor entered, Martha felt an odd sense of familiarity, though she couldn't place why. Dr. Mitchell was perhaps 52, with graying brown hair pulled back efficiently and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Mitchell said, extending her hand with professional warmth, "Dr. Reynolds has briefed me on your case." "Before we begin the examination, I need to understand the timeline. When did you first notice this growth?" Martha's hands twisted in her lap. About 6 years ago, maybe a little longer. It started so small I thought it was just—" She paused, touching the scarf self-consciously. "Aging. And it's grown consistently over that period?" "Yes, but slowly at first. The last year it's been more aggressive." Dr. Mitchell made notes, her pen scratching across the chart. "Any family history of tumors, cysts, or unusual growths?" "No, nothing like this." Martha paused, then added quietly, "Though I suppose there are things about family history I might not know." Something in Martha's tone made Dr. Mitchell look up sharply, but she continued with her questions. "Any history of head trauma, accidents, falls, anything that might have caused injury to that area?" Martha's breath caught almost imperceptibly. No. I mean, nothing serious." "Everyone has little bumps and bruises over the years." James noticed his mother's hesitation but said nothing. He'd learned that pushing Martha too hard only made her retreat further into herself. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to need to examine the area now. I know this is uncomfortable, but I need to see what we're dealing with." Martha's hands trembled as she unwound the scarf. Dr. Mitchell's professional composure never wavered, though James saw her blink twice when the full extent of the growth was revealed. The mass dominated the left side of Martha's neck and had begun to distort the shape of her jaw. The skin was stretched tight, with visible blood vessels creating a web-like pattern across its surface. "How long since you've been able to sleep comfortably?" Dr. Mitchell asked, gently palpating the edges of the growth. "I sleep in Robert's recliner mostly. Lying flat makes it difficult." The examination was thorough and professional, but Martha could see concern growing in Dr. Mitchell's expression. When the doctor stepped back, her diagnosis was frank. "Mrs. Thompson, this appears to be a complex cyst that has developed its own blood supply and possibly attached to surrounding tissue. The size and location make this a serious surgical case. We'll need MRI imaging to understand the full extent before planning an approach." "What kind of surgery?" James asked. "Major surgery. This will require a full surgical team, possibly 6 to 8 hours, and extended recovery time. I won't lie to you, there are risks. The growth is close to major blood vessels and nerve pathways." Martha felt the room spinning slightly. "And the cost?" Dr. Mitchell consulted her computer. "With your Medicare coverage, your out-of-pocket expense should be around $4,000, assuming no complications." $4,000? Martha's emergency fund could cover it, but barely, and that assumed everything went perfectly. She thought about the collection notices in her desk drawer, the rationed medications, the careful calculations that governed every purchase. "I need time to think about it," Martha said quietly. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Mitchell's voice was gentle but firm, "I need you to understand something. This condition is not stable. The growth is continuing, and there's increasing risk of rupture, infection, or worse. I strongly recommend we schedule surgery within the next 2 weeks." As they scheduled the follow-up appointments and MRI, Martha noticed Dr. Mitchell watching her with unusual intensity. There was something beyond professional concern in her gaze, a personal interest that felt familiar yet unplaceable. Walking to the car, James finally voiced his frustration. "Mom, you have the money. I saw it in your jewelry box." "Why are you hesitating?" Martha stopped walking and faced her son in the medical center parking lot. "That money represents 30 years of saving every penny I could. 30 years of buying store-brand groceries, wearing the same winter coat, driving a car held together with prayers and duct tape. If I spend it on surgery and then need long-term care, or if something else goes wrong medically, I'll have nothing. But if you don't have the surgery, you might die anyway. But at least I won't die poor and homeless." Martha's voice cracked with the weight of fears she'd carried alone for too long. You don't understand what it's like to be old and alone, James. You have your career, your health insurance, your retirement accounts. I have a teacher's pension that barely covers utilities and a house that's falling apart. The drive home passed in heavy silence. That evening, while Martha rested, James made phone calls to financial advisors, to his own bank, to anyone who might help him understand his mother's options. What he learned only deepened his guilt. Martha was right to be terrified. Long-term care costs averaged $60,000 annually. Medicare covered virtually none of it. Her modest savings, accumulated through decades of careful living, would disappear in months if she needed assisted living. The surgery she needed to survive might leave her financially unable to afford recovery. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Betty Mae Wilson arrived with a casserole and 3 other church ladies, all carrying covered dishes and determined expressions. "Martha Ellen Thompson," announced Dorothy Patterson, the church treasurer. "We need to talk." Martha tried to retreat to her bedroom, but the church ladies were having none of it. They'd organized what they called an intervention, though it felt more like a loving ambush. "The whole town's talking about what happened at the Medicare meeting," said Nancy Williams, "and we've decided we're not letting pride kill our favorite teacher." They'd done their research. Between them, they'd contacted every family whose children Martha had taught over her 40-year career. The response had been overwhelming. Former students, now adults with children of their own, wanted to help the woman who'd shaped their early years. "We've started a fund," Dorothy announced, pulling out a notebook filled with pledges. "So far, we've raised $12,000, and that's just from people in town. When word gets out to all the families who moved away—" Martha burst into tears. "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Betty Mae said firmly. "It's gratitude. Do you have any idea how many children you've taught to read? How many kids you helped through difficult times?" The women had stories Martha had forgotten, small kindnesses that had seemed natural at the time but had shaped young lives in lasting ways. Sarah Jenkins told them Martha bought her school supplies out of her own pocket when her father lost his job. Tommy Walsh said Martha stayed after school every day for months to help him with his reading problems. Children from troubled homes who found safety in her classroom. Struggling readers who discovered confidence through her patient teaching. Families going through divorce or financial hardship who found support in Martha's quiet care. "The way we see it," Nancy continued, "you've been making deposits in this community for 40 years. Now it's time to make a withdrawal." The outpouring of support continued over the following days. Cards arrived from across the country. Former students who'd moved to California, Texas, Florida, all carrying memories of Mrs. Thompson and checks to help with her medical expenses. A Facebook page started by one of her 1990s students reached hundreds of people within days. James watched his mother struggle with accepting help, understanding finally that her fierce independence wasn't pride but survival strategy. She'd learned to depend only on herself because depending on others felt too risky. Even depending on him had felt dangerous. What if he disappeared again? The breakthrough came when Dr. Sarah Mitchell called with Martha's MRI results. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to come in immediately. The imaging shows something unexpected that changes our surgical approach." Martha's blood turned cold. "Is it cancer?" "No, not cancer. But there appears to be a foreign object embedded within the cyst structure. Something metallic. Do you have any memory of trauma to that area? Perhaps something that might have caused a foreign body to become embedded in the tissue?" Martha's hand went to her throat, and for a moment she couldn't speak. James watched his mother's face drain of color, saw her hands begin to tremble. "Mrs. Thompson, are you there?" "Yes," Martha whispered. "Yes, I'm here. When do you need to see me? Can you come in tomorrow morning? This finding significantly complicates the surgical planning, but it also means we need to proceed more urgently. The foreign object could be causing complications we hadn't anticipated." After hanging up, Martha sat motionless in Robert's recliner. James had never seen his mother look so fragile, so frightened. "Mom, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Martha turned to face her son, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets she'd buried for decades. "James, there are things about my life, about our family, that I've never told you. Things I hoped would stay buried forever." She paused, gathering courage that felt decades overdue. "But if they're going to cut me open and if they're going to discover things, you need to know the truth." The morning of surgery arrived gray and cold, matching Martha's mood as she sat in the preoperative waiting room at Regional Medical Center. Despite the community fundraising that had covered her medical expenses, despite James's unwavering support, she felt like she was walking toward her own execution. Dr. Sarah Mitchell appeared in scrubs, her professional demeanor masking what Martha sensed was personal concern beyond the typical doctor-patient relationship. There was something familiar about the way Dr. Mitchell looked at her, a recognition that went deeper than their previous appointments. "Mrs. Thompson, we're ready for you. The surgical team is prepared, and we've planned for the complications the foreign object might present." Dr. Mitchell paused, studying Martha's face. "Are you ready?" Martha nodded, though she felt anything but ready. James squeezed her hand as the nurses prepared to wheel her into the operating room. "I'll be right here when you wake up, Mom. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The operating room was blindingly white, filled with machines that beeped and hummed with technological precision. As the anesthesia mask covered her face, Martha's last conscious thought was a prayer she'd been afraid to pray for decades. "Please let the truth finally set me free. Doctor." Mitchell began the procedure with confident precision, her experienced hands navigating the complex anatomy of Martha's neck. The growth was larger than anticipated, and its blood supply more extensive. What should have been a 4-hour procedure stretched into the 6th hour as the surgical team carefully dissected layers of scar tissue that had built up around the foreign object. "There's something here," Dr. Mitchell announced to her team. "Metallic as we expected, but there's more complexity to it than the imaging suggested." The surgical resident assisting her leaned in for a better view. What kind of object could be embedded this deeply and maintain this level of tissue reaction? Dr. Mitchell carefully extracted what appeared to be a gold locket, tarnished and partially dissolved by decades of body chemistry, but still recognizable. The surgical team fell silent as she placed it in a specimen container. But that wasn't all. Embedded deeper, they found fragments of a mirror, small pieces of glass that had somehow worked their way into the tissue. "In 35 years of surgery, I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Mitchell murmured. "These objects have been here for decades. The tissue response suggests initial trauma, then gradual encapsulation." The surgical resident, Dr. James Chen, studied the extracted materials with fascination. The patient would have had to sustain significant trauma for objects to be embedded this deeply. Was there any history of accident or assault in her records? Dr. Mitchell paused in her suturing, her mind racing. Something about Martha Thompson had been nagging at her since their first meeting. The name, the age, the location. Pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling. "Dr. Mitchell," the anesthesiologist called out. "Patient's blood pressure is dropping. Heart rate's becoming irregular." Martha was fighting the anesthesia, her body responding to some deep psychological trauma even while unconscious. Her vitals fluctuated wildly, as if she was reliving the events that had placed these objects in her body decades ago. "She's experiencing some kind of stress response," Dr. Mitchell observed, working quickly to complete the surgery while monitoring Martha's vital signs. "Increase the sedation slightly, but keep her stable." As Dr. Mitchell sutured the final layers of tissue, Martha began speaking under anesthesia, fragmented words that made the surgical team exchange glances. "Don't tell Robert. Thomas is gone. Had to stop him. The mirror. So much blood." Dr. Mitchell's hands stilled for a moment. Thomas. The name triggered a memory she'd been struggling to access since meeting Martha. Thomas Anderson. Her father. The father who had abandoned her and her mother when Sarah was 3 years old, disappearing without explanation in 1979. The realization hit Dr. Mitchell like electricity. Martha Thompson wasn't just a patient. She was connected to the central mystery of Sarah's childhood. Her father hadn't abandoned them. Something had happened to him, something that involved this woman. Dr. Mitchell." Dr. Chen noticed her pause. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I'm fine. Let's finish this procedure." But Sarah's mind was reeling. The timeline matched perfectly. Her father's disappearance in 1979, Martha's obvious trauma, the objects embedded in her neck. Pieces of a story that had haunted Sarah's entire life were suddenly coming together. Martha's surgery concluded successfully, with all foreign objects removed and the growth completely excised. The tissue samples were sent for pathological analysis, and the extracted locket and mirror fragments were documented as evidence of historical trauma. But for Dr. Mitchell, the medical procedure had raised more questions than it had answered. As Martha was moved to recovery, Dr. Mitchell found herself staring at the locket in its specimen container. She had seen this piece of jewelry before, in old family photographs her grandmother had shown her. This was her paternal grandmother's locket, the one her father had inherited when his mother died in 1977. The implications were staggering. If Martha Thompson had this locket embedded in her neck, if she had sustained trauma involving mirror fragments on the same timeline as Thomas Anderson's disappearance, then Sarah was looking at evidence of what might have been her father's final moments. Dr. Mitchell stepped into the hallway and called her grandmother, now 93 and living in a nursing home 3 hours away. "Grandma Rose, it's Sarah. I need to ask you about Dad, about Thomas. Do you remember the locket you gave him? The one that belonged to your mother?" Her grandmother's voice was clear despite her age. "Of course, dear. Beautiful piece, gold with intricate engraving. He said he was going to give it to that teacher he married. What was her name? Martha something? Why do you ask?" "Grandma, what do you remember about Martha?" "About Dad's disappearance? Such a sweet girl, that Martha. So sad what Thomas put her through. He was drinking heavily those last months, coming home angry, mean as a rattlesnake. Your great-grandfather Anderson always said he had his father's temper." Rose paused, her voice growing smaller. "The last time I saw them together, Martha had bruises on her arms, made excuses about falling downstairs. But I knew better. I should have said something, but back then you didn't interfere in a man's marriage." Sarah felt her world shifting. "Did you ever suspect that Dad didn't just leave town?" "Honey, I always wondered. Thomas was many things, a drunk, a mean husband when he drank. But he wasn't the type to just disappear. He was too proud, too rooted in that town. When he vanished, I figured something bad had happened. But the police weren't interested in investigating a man who'd just abandoned his wife." After ending the call, Dr. Mitchell stood in the hospital corridor, grappling with the possibility that she had just operated on the woman who might have killed her father. But strangely, she felt no anger, only a complex mixture of understanding and relief. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had been stopped by someone defending herself against his violence. Martha began waking from anesthesia as the afternoon sun slanted through her recovery room windows. James was at her bedside, holding her hand as she emerged from the medicated fog that had protected her from decades of buried trauma. "The surgery went well, Mom," James said softly. "Dr. Mitchell removed everything. You're going to be fine." Martha's hand went instinctively to her neck, feeling the bandages where the growth had been. For the first time in 6 years, the left side of her neck felt normal, unencumbered by the secret she'd been carrying. "Did they find—" Martha's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. "They found it," James confirmed. "A locket and some other pieces. Dr. Mitchell has everything documented." Martha closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of terror and relief. The evidence was out of her body, out in the world where it could be examined, questioned, potentially traced back to that terrible night decades ago. "What happens now?" she whispered. Before James could answer, there was a soft knock on the recovery room door. Dr. Mitchell entered, still in her surgical scrubs, carrying herself with the careful composure of someone who had just made a life-altering discovery. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been carrying a weight I can finally put down," Martha answered honestly. Dr. Mitchell pulled up a chair beside the bed, her movements deliberate and measured. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to talk to you about what we found during surgery. But more than that, I need to talk to you about my father." "About Thomas Anderson." The words hung in the recovery room air like a thunderclap. Martha's heart monitor began beeping rapidly as her blood pressure spiked, and James instinctively moved closer to his mother's bedside, sensing that their world was about to shift again. Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat perfectly still, her professional composure masking the emotional earthquake happening beneath the surface. "Mrs. Thompson, I believe you knew my father as your first husband. Thomas Anderson disappeared in June 1979 when I was 3 years old. I've spent my entire life wondering what happened to him." Martha's face went ashen against the white hospital pillows. She stared at Dr. Mitchell with growing recognition, seeing now what had been nagging at her subconscious during their previous meetings: the shape of the eyes, the stubborn set of the jaw, even the way she held her head when concentrating. Sarah was Thomas Anderson's daughter, grown into the accomplished woman Martha had helped nurture as a frightened third grader. "Your little Sarah," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sarah Anderson from my 1982 class. The quiet little girl who used to sit in the front row because she couldn't see the blackboard. You remember me, Doctor?" Mitchell's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the vulnerable child who had once looked up to Mrs. Thompson for safety and understanding. Martha nodded slowly, tears beginning to form. "You were so shy, so small for your age. Your grandmother would walk you to school sometimes, and she'd always ask how you were doing in class. She said your father had left when you were very young." James looked between the two women, struggling to process the implications. "So Dr. Mitchell she's your stepdaughter?" "For 8 months, yes," Martha said quietly. "Though Sarah was raised by her grandmother after he left." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to know the truth about what happened to my father. The locket we removed from your neck, it belonged to my great-grandmother. My father inherited it when his mother died. How did it end up embedded in your tissue?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Martha looked at James, then at Sarah, seeing in the surgeon's face the same earnest expression that little Sarah had worn when asking difficult questions in 3rd grade. "Sarah, honey," Martha began, her voice trembling, "what do you remember about your father?" "Very little. I was only 3 when he disappeared. But my grandmother told me stories over the years. She said he was troubled, that he drank too much, that he had a temper." Sarah paused, studying Martha's reaction. "She also said that after he married you, he seemed to get worse, not better." Martha felt the weight of 45 years of secret-keeping pressing down on her chest. "Your grandmother was right. Thomas was. He was not well. The drinking made him angry, violent. He would—" She touched the bandaged area of her neck unconsciously. "He hurt you," Sarah said, not as a question but as a statement of medical fact. Yes, many times. Martha's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if confession was giving her courage. The night he disappeared, we'd had the worst fight yet. I'd filed for divorce papers without telling him, and he found them. He came home drunk and enraged. Sarah felt her medical training take over, analyzing the trauma pattern. The force would have had to be significant to embed the locket that deeply into tissue. It hit hard enough to split the skin and drive metal fragments deep. But that wasn't the worst part. Martha looked directly at Sarah now, preparing to tell Thomas's daughter what had really happened to her father. When I tried to defend myself, I grabbed a mirror from the bedroom. When he came at me again, I swung it at him. Martha's voice broke as she continued. He was drunk, unsteady on his feet. When the mirror hit him, he fell backward and struck his head on the corner of the fireplace hearth. There was so much blood, and he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. Sarah sat in stunned silence, processing not just the information but the emotional complexity of learning that her former teacher had killed her father in self-defense. I was 28 years old, terrified, and I panicked, Martha continued. I'd called the police on Thomas twice before when he'd beaten me, and they'd done nothing. Told me it was a domestic matter, that I should try to be a better wife. Thomas was well respected in town, and I was just the school teacher. Who would have believed me? James watched Dr. Mitchell's face for signs of anger or judgment, but saw only professional curiosity mixed with what appeared to be relief. So, you buried him, Sarah said quietly. Martha nodded. In the woods behind the old Miller property. I wrapped him in a tarp, put him in his truck, and drove out there. Dug a grave and buried him, then drove his truck to the bus station and left it there to make it look like he'd abandoned us. The recovery room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Martha's monitors. Sarah stared at her hands, processing the revelation that had answered a lifelong question in the most unexpected way possible. Dr. Mitchell, James said carefully, what does this mean legally? I mean for my mother? Sarah looked up, her expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. Mr. Thompson, I need you both to understand something. I became a surgeon partly because I wanted to help people heal from trauma. I've seen hundreds of domestic violence cases over the years, and I understand the dynamics in ways that weren't understood in 1979. She stood and walked to the window, gathering her thoughts. What your mother described sounds like textbook self-defense during a domestic violence assault. The pattern of previous abuse, the escalation, the victim's fear for her life, these are all factors that courts recognize today. Martha felt a flutter of hope mixed with terror. But I buried the body. I hid evidence. I lied to police. You were a traumatized abuse victim who had no faith in the system's ability to protect you, Sarah replied. And based on what my grandmother told me about how domestic violence was handled in 1979, your fear was probably justified. Sarah returned to her chair, looking directly at Martha. Mrs. Thompson, I need to tell you something. I've wondered my entire life what happened to my father. Part of me hoped he was alive somewhere, that maybe he'd come back someday. But another part of me, the part that remembered my grandmother's careful words about his drinking and his temper, suspected something terrible had happened. Martha searched Sarah's face for signs of hatred or condemnation, but found neither. When I was in medical school, Sarah continued, I specialized in trauma surgery, partly because I wanted to help people who'd been hurt the way my grandmother hinted that you had been hurt. I've treated dozens of domestic violence victims, and I know what that kind of terror looks like. James found his voice. Are you saying you're not going to report this to police? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her medical ethics against her personal understanding of justice. I'm saying that as a physician, my primary obligation is to my patient's well-being. Mrs. Thompson has carried this trauma for 45 years. She's suffered enough. Martha began crying again, but these were tears of relief rather than fear. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, doesn't bring your father back, but I am truly sorry for what happened and for what it cost you." Sarah moved closer to Martha's bed, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Thompson, do you remember what you taught us in 3rd grade about forgiveness?" Martha nodded, remembering those classroom discussions about kindness and second chances. "You said forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about choosing not to let the hurt control our lives anymore." Sarah continued, her voice carrying the wisdom of both the child who had lost her father and the woman who had dedicated her life to healing others. "I forgave my father years ago for abandoning me. Now I understand he didn't abandon me. He was stopped by someone defending herself against his violence. In a strange way, that's easier to forgive than abandonment." The three of them sat in the growing afternoon shadows, processing the weight of secrets revealed and burdens shared. James marveled at the complexity of the situation. His mother's surgeon was the daughter of the man his mother had killed in self-defense 45 years ago. "What happens now?" Martha asked finally. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Now you heal from surgery. The tissue samples will be analyzed, but they'll show chronic inflammation consistent with old trauma. The locket and mirror fragments will be documented as foreign objects removed during a medical procedure." She paused, then added, "As for the other matter, that's between us. My father's case was closed decades ago as a missing person. There's no active investigation, no one looking for answers except me, and I have my answer now." Martha reached out and took Sarah's hand, the gesture spanning decades and bridging the gap between teacher and student, victim and survivor. "You saved my life today," Martha said. "Just like I tried to save yours when you were 8 years old and came to school with bruises on your arms." Sarah squeezed Martha's hand, understanding finally why her former teacher had always seemed to pay special attention to the quiet, sad children in her classes. "We saved each other," Sarah replied. "You taught me to read, to believe in myself, to become someone who could help others heal. And today I was able to help you finally let go of a secret that was literally killing you." But the relief of confession and forgiveness was short-lived. As evening fell over the recovery room, Martha's condition began to deteriorate. The trauma of surgery combined with the emotional shock of revelation had pushed her 74-year-old body to its limits. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and her heart rhythm became increasingly irregular. "I need to examine her," Sarah said, noting the alarming changes in Martha's vital signs. What she found sent ice through her veins, internal bleeding, likely from a blood vessel that had been nicked during the complex surgery. "We need to get her back to the operating room immediately," Sarah announced, her professional composure masking the personal terror she felt. "There's hemorrhaging that we missed." James watched helplessly as his mother was rushed back into surgery, this time fighting not just for her health, but for her life. The irony was devastating. After 45 years of carrying Thomas Anderson's violence in her body, Martha might die from the surgery that was supposed to free her from it. The second operation lasted through the night. Sarah worked with desperate precision, locating and repairing the damaged blood vessel, while Martha's life hung in the balance. The surgical team worked in tense silence, understanding that they were fighting not just medical complications, but decades of trauma that had weakened their patient's will to survive. "Come on, Martha," Sarah whispered as she sutured the repair. "You've survived too much to give up now. Sarah needs her teacher. James needs his mother. And I need to know that some stories have happy endings." At 4:47 a.m., Martha's vital signs finally stabilized. The bleeding had stopped and her body began responding to treatment, but she remained unconscious, her mind seemingly reluctant to return to a world where her deepest secrets had been exposed. James hadn't left the hospital. He sat in the family waiting area, staring at his hands and replaying every conversation he'd had with his mother over the past 2 years. How had he missed the signs? How had he been so focused on his own life that he'd failed to see his mother drowning in isolation and shame? Betty Mae Wilson arrived at dawn, carrying coffee and the news that the entire town was praying for Martha. "That woman taught half this county to read," she said firmly. "We're not losing her now." By noon, the waiting room had filled with former students, fellow teachers, and community members who had heard about Martha's condition. Dorothy Patterson organized a prayer circle. Nancy Williams coordinated meal deliveries for James. The outpouring of love was overwhelming, but Martha remained unconscious, fighting battles in her mind that no surgery could address. Sarah checked on Martha hourly, each visit revealing her dual role as doctor and family member. Technically, Martha had been married to her father for less than a year, but their connection ran deeper than legal definitions. Martha had been more of a mother figure to Sarah than anyone since her grandmother's death 5 years earlier. On the second day, James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "I'm moving back to Millbrook," he announced to Betty Mae. "I'm going to take care of my mother, and I'm going to open an architectural practice here. This town could use someone who designs homes instead of monuments to corporate greed." Betty Mae smiled, recognizing the stubborn determination that Martha had passed to her son. "Your mother's going to be proud when she wakes up, and she will wake up, James. That woman survived 45 years of carrying the weight of the world. She's not giving up now." The breakthrough came on the third day, when Sarah was checking Martha's neurological responses. As she shined a light in Martha's eyes, the older woman suddenly grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Sarah?" Martha's voice was barely a whisper, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Did I dream it, or did we really talk about Thomas?" "We talked," Sarah confirmed, her professional composure cracking with relief. "And we're going to be okay. All of us." Martha's recovery accelerated once she regained consciousness. The physical healing was remarkable for a woman her age, but the emotional transformation was even more dramatic. For the first time in 45 years, Martha slept without nightmares. She ate meals at the bedside table instead of picking at food while standing, afraid to sit still long enough for thoughts to catch up with her. Most remarkably, she began to laugh again, genuine, spontaneous laughter that surprised even her. "You know what's funny?" Martha said during one of Sarah's visits. "I spent 45 years thinking I was hiding from my past, but I was actually running toward my purpose. Every child I taught, every difficult situation I helped a family navigate, it was all preparation for this moment, for being able to help other women who are carrying secrets like I carried mine." The idea emerged gradually, born from conversations between patient and doctor, teacher and former student, survivor and healer. Sarah approached Martha with a proposal that would formalize their unique relationship and transform their shared trauma into a force for healing others. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," Sarah said during one of their daily talks. "Something that addresses both domestic violence and the long-term health impacts of trauma. I'd like you to be the co-founder and primary spokesperson." Martha was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. "That would mean going fully public with the story? Everything?" "Yes, it would. But Martha, think about the women who are carrying secrets like you carried yours. Think about the victims who think they have no options, no voice, no value. You could show them that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that building a meaningful life after trauma is possible." The decision wasn't immediate. Martha needed time to process the possibility of transforming her deepest shame into her greatest contribution. But as she watched Sarah work with other trauma patients, seeing the compassion and understanding that came from the surgeon's own journey of healing, Martha began to understand that their connection wasn't coincidence, it was purpose. "All right," Martha said finally. "Let's do it. Let's turn this story into something that helps other people find their way out of the dark." The Martha Thompson Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Trauma Recovery launched 6 months later with a mission statement that reflected both women's journeys, helping survivors transform their pain into purpose, their secrets into strength, and their shame into service. But first, Martha had to finish healing, not just from surgery but from 4.5 decades of carrying a weight that was never meant to be carried alone. 3 months after surgery, Martha Thompson stood in front of her bedroom mirror for the first time in 6 years without immediately turning away. The surgical scar on her neck had healed to a thin pink line, barely visible unless someone looked closely. More importantly, the weight she'd carried, both physical and emotional, was finally gone. The transformation went far deeper than her appearance. For the first time since 1979, Martha slept through the night without nightmares. She ate meals at her kitchen table instead of standing at the counter, afraid to sit still long enough for thoughts to catch up with her. Most remarkably, she had begun to laugh again, genuine, spontaneous laughter that surprised even her. James had kept his promise to face the future together. He'd taken a leave of absence from his architectural firm in Seattle and moved into his childhood bedroom, initially to help with his mother's recovery, but increasingly because he realized how much of his own life he'd been missing by staying away. "I'm thinking about opening a small practice here," James told Martha one morning over breakfast. "Millbrook could use an architect, and I'm tired of designing soulless commercial buildings. I want to create homes where families can be happy." Martha smiled, recognizing the boy who used to build elaborate structures with Lincoln logs in the same kitchen where they now shared coffee and conversation every morning. "Your father would be so proud. He always said you had the gift of seeing what could be rather than just what was." The reference to Robert no longer carried the undertone of guilt that had shadowed Martha's memories for decades. She could speak of her late husband with pure love now, unburdened by the secret that had made her feel unworthy of his affection. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had become a regular presence in Martha's life. Though their relationship had evolved far beyond doctor and patient, Sarah visited monthly, ostensibly for medical follow-ups, but increasingly they spent their time talking about teaching, about healing, about the strange circularity of their connected lives. During one visit, Sarah brought photo albums from her grandmother's house. "I thought you might like to see these," she said, settling onto Martha's sofa with the careful respect one shows precious artifacts. The albums contained pictures of Thomas as a child, a serious boy with Sarah's stubborn chin standing beside his own father, a stern-looking man with hard eyes. There were photos of Thomas in high school, already showing signs of the anger that would later consume him. But there were also pictures of him as a young man, before the drinking and violence, when he still smiled genuinely and looked capable of happiness. "Your grandmother told me once that Thomas's father was a violent man," Martha said quietly, studying a photograph of Thomas at perhaps 8 years old, his face already guarded. "She said the drinking started after his father died, like he was trying to drown something that wouldn't stay buried." Sarah nodded. "Grandmother Rose always said trauma runs in families until someone decides to break the cycle. I think in a terrible way you broke it for both of us. Thomas couldn't have been a father to me, not with his demons. But you taught me that adults could be safe, that learning was possible, that I had value." The conversation led to a decision that surprised them both. Martha asked Sarah if she would consider having Thanksgiving dinner together, along with James and Sarah's own small family. "It seems fitting," Martha said, "that we should be grateful together for the strange ways life brings people back to each other." The Thanksgiving gathering became a new tradition, though it took time for everyone to adjust to the complexity of their relationships. Sarah's husband, David, was initially uncomfortable dining with the woman who had killed his wife's father, until Sarah explained the full context of domestic violence and self-defense. Their two young children, Emma, 8, and Michael, 6, simply accepted Martha as Dr. Mom's teacher friend and delighted in her stories about the old days of classroom teaching. Martha found herself falling naturally back into her teaching role, helping Emma with her reading homework and showing Michael how to identify birds in the backyard. The children's presence filled the house with laughter and energy that had been missing since James's own childhood. The most profound healing came through Martha's decision to begin speaking publicly about domestic violence. Sarah had connected her with the regional women's shelter, where Martha's story resonated powerfully with current victims of abuse. Her message was simple but revolutionary for women of her generation. Staying alive and staying safe are more important than staying married or staying quiet. "I carried shame for 45 years, Martha would tell groups of women, many young enough to be her granddaughters. "I thought protecting myself made me a killer, but I learned that sometimes survival requires actions we never thought we'd be capable of. The measure of our worth isn't in the terrible things that happen to us, it's in how we choose to heal and help others heal." Her talks drew standing ovations, but more importantly, they drew women who approached her afterward with their own stories of abuse, their own fears about leaving dangerous situations. Martha began volunteering as a counselor, her decades of teaching experience translating naturally to helping traumatized women find their voices and their strength. James watched his mother's transformation with amazement and pride. The woman who had spent years hiding from the world was now traveling throughout Ohio and neighboring states, speaking to audiences of hundreds about courage and survival. He began accompanying her to speaking engagements, initially for support, but increasingly as her business manager and advocate. "You know what's funny?" Martha said one evening as they drove home from a particularly moving presentation at a college campus. "I spent 45 years thinking I was running from my past, but I was actually running toward my purpose. Every child I taught, every difficult situation I helped a family navigate, it was all preparation for this." The most unexpected development came when Sarah approached Martha with a proposal that would formalize their unique relationship. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," Sarah said during one of their monthly visits, "something that addresses both domestic violence and the long-term health impacts of trauma. I'd like you to be the co-founder and primary spokesperson." Martha was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. That would mean going fully public with the story. Everything? Yes, it would. But Martha, think about the women who are carrying secrets like you carried yours. Think about the victims who think they have no options, no voice, no value. You could show them that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that building a meaningful life after trauma is possible. The Martha Thompson Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Trauma Recovery launched 6 months later with a mission statement that reflected both women's journeys, helping survivors transform their pain into purpose, their secrets into strength, and their shame into service. Martha's first major interview with a national magazine generated hundreds of letters from readers sharing their own stories of abuse, survival, and recovery. The Foundation's website crashed from traffic within hours of the article's publication, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The current principal of Millbrook Elementary contacted Martha to announce that the school board had voted unanimously to name the new library wing in her honor. The Martha Ellen Thompson Learning Center, Principal Jennifer Martinez explained, will focus on creating safe spaces for children to learn and grow, especially those facing challenges at home. At the dedication ceremony, attended by hundreds of former students spanning 4 decades, Martha stood before the crowd that had once known her only as their beloved teacher. Now they knew her as something more complex and more inspiring, a survivor who had chosen courage over comfort, truth over silence, and service over self-protection. 45 years ago, Martha told the gathered crowd, I made a choice to protect myself from violence. Today, I make a choice to protect others by sharing my story. Both choices required courage I didn't know I possessed. But here's what I've learned. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's teaching others to be brave by showing them what survival looks like. Sarah sat in the front row with her children, watching the woman who had taught her to read now teaching an entire community about resilience and redemption. In her purse, she carried a small jewelry box containing the restored locket, cleaned, polished, and fitted with a new chain. After the ceremony, she planned to give it to Martha, transformed from evidence of trauma into a symbol of survival. As Martha concluded her speech, she looked out over the faces of people whose lives she had touched as a teacher, a survivor, and now as an advocate. She thought about the scared young woman who had buried a secret in the woods 45 years ago, never imagining that one day she would stand before hundreds of people unashamed and unafraid. The little girl who had dreamed of becoming a teacher to help children learn had indeed spent her life teaching. But the most important lesson she had learned, and could now teach others, was that it's never too late to stop hiding from your own life and start living it with purpose, courage, and hope. In the end, Martha realized, the secret that had nearly killed her had also saved her, leading her to exactly where and who she was meant to be. The trauma that had defined her first 74 years had become the foundation for a new chapter filled with healing, purpose, and unexpected joy. As the ceremony concluded and people began to approach her with their own stories of struggle and survival, Martha understood that her greatest teaching moments were still ahead of her. Every woman who found courage through her story, every family that learned to break cycles of violence, every child who grew up knowing that survival was possible, they were her real legacy. The scared teacher who had once hidden behind scarves had become a beacon of hope for others lost in their own darkness. And in helping them find their way to the light, Martha had finally found her way home to herself. That evening, as Martha sat in her kitchen with James and Sarah, sharing stories and planning the Foundation's next initiatives, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: complete peace. The weight of secrets was gone, replaced by the lightness of purpose. The shame of survival had transformed into the pride of service. "I think Dad would be proud," James said, watching his mother's animated discussion of their plans to help other trauma survivors. "Robert always said the best teachers never stop learning," Martha replied. "I guess I'm finally ready for my most important lesson, that our wounds don't define us, but what we do with them can." Outside, snow began to fall on Millbrook, covering the town in fresh whiteness. Inside the warm kitchen, three people connected by tragedy but bound by hope continued planning ways to help others transform their darkest moments into sources of light. The story that had begun with violence and shame was ending with healing and grace, proving that even the most broken things can become beautiful again. Martha's story reminds us that the secrets we carry to protect ourselves often become the very chains that imprison us. At 74, she discovered that the shame she'd hidden for 45 years wasn't her burden to bear alone. It was her strength to share with others. How many of us have spent decades believing that our past mistakes, our survival choices, or our moments of human frailty define our worth? Martha thought protecting herself from an abusive husband made her unworthy of love, undeserving of peace. She lived as a prisoner in her own home, hiding from a world that actually needed her wisdom. But when she finally found the courage to speak her truth, she discovered something powerful. Our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts to others. The very experiences that made her feel broken were exactly what other women needed to hear to find their own strength. At any age, we can choose to stop hiding from our stories and start using them to heal ourselves and others. Your past doesn't disqualify you from happiness. It qualifies you to help others find theirs. What secret have you been carrying that might actually be someone else's lifeline? When did you last choose courage over comfort? And how did it change your life?